Hello everyone, my name is Xuande, a student of Research Center for Pacific Island Countries in Liaocheng University. And I'm really honored to attend this international conference today. The title of my article is an analysis of the status quo of China's aid to Pacific Island countries. Now let me briefly introduce the content of my article. Now you can see there are three parts of my article. The first one is background, the next one is discussion, and the last one is conclusion. So let's begin from the background. Let's start with the international environment in this region. In recent years, the United States has emphasized its return to the Asia-Pacific. Japan has implemented a plan to advance south, and Australia has tried to consolidate its leadership in the region, and Taiwan also tried to expand its influence in this region. And even the European Union, India, Indonesia, Singapore, and other countries have aspirations and have a certain influence on the region. And the game situation among parties in the region has intensified. And as for China, as this country gradually goes global, its overseas intents have also begun to extend to all corners of the world, including Pacific Island countries. So the trend, investment, tourism, and cultural exchange with the Pacific Island countries also getting closer. So in September and October in 2013, the President Xi proposed the construction of the Belt and Road Initiative during his visit to Kazakhstan and Indonesia. As a natural extension of the Belt and Road, the South Pacific region has received China's increasing attention. And then let me introduce the situation of South Pacific Island countries. They include 9 fully sovereign countries, including all Oceania countries, except Australia and New Zealand. These countries have the typical attributes of small developing states. It refers to some small low-cost countries. An academic believes the small extent developing states are facing similar problems, such as remote geographic locations, a single economic development structure, lack of labor and natural resources, weak adaptability to natural disasters, and difficulty in effectively participating in international affairs. And small island developing states are usually classified as the latest developed countries. Their per capita income is low and they are vulnerable to natural disasters and financial crisis. They are highly dependent on international financial and technological assistance. And on this picture, you can see 3 features of Pacific Island countries. The first one is these countries are one of the areas where small island developing states are constituent, and most of the Pacific Island countries are developing countries. However, these countries have vast ocean area. Their inclusive economic zone accounts for 9% of global surface area and 10% of ocean area. They have abundant natural resources, especially aquatic and mineral resources. The tuna production in this area accounts for more than half of the world's total production. And due to the small size of the economic and slow development of national economy, these unique resources of the Pacific Island countries have not been well developed. The vast majority of South Pacific Island countries are facing the problem of single economic structure, storage of capital and technology. And secondly, the next feature is the natural environment of the Pacific Island country is extremely fragile, and they have particularly strong demand of environmental issues Due to the surrounding sea, the South Pacific Island countries are extremely vulnerable to natural disasters such as volcanic eruption and typhoons, and ecological environment can't be quickly restored once it is destroyed. And the third feature is this country generally depend on regional powers. Due to excessive reliance on international trade and aid to meet their own domestic need, imports in foreign trade far exceed exports, and foreign economic and trade have serious imbalance. Therefore, the South Pacific Island countries are very vulnerable to some turbulence in the outside world, and they show more dependence on aid from major power. So from the first part, you can see many countries pay more and more attention to the Pacific Island countries. Now, let's go to the second part, discussion. Let's start with the international scholars' research on China's aid to Pacific Island countries. Some early studies focus on China's influence on the geopolitics of Pacific Island countries and its relationship with traditional donor countries in the region. Some scholars generally hold a negative attitude towards China's aid. And in this picture, you can see some early representative articles. The first one is John Henderson and Benjamin Reilly's article, Dragon in Paradise, China's Rising Star in Oceania. This article emphasizes the geopolitical significance of Pacific Island countries to China. The authors believe that the rising China has a characteristic of expansion. China's long-term goal is to eventually replace the United States as a superpower in the Pacific region. China's existence in the region should be understood from the Pacific or global background, and China's assistance to the region is more political than economic. And in addition, the author believes that the region has potential military significance for China, such as using these islands to develop land-based anti-ship missiles to compensate for the weakness of China's navy. And the authors also mentioned the attitude of island countries toward China. They believe the island countries are playing a China card with the purpose of cooperating with potential U.S. opponents to revival the shrinking aid of Western countries of the Cold War. And the next article is the China's syndrome, China's growing presence in the Southwest Pacific by Susan Wendy-Bank. And this article also have a negative attitude towards China's aid to Pacific Island countries. The author believes that China and Taiwan are engaged in the new Cold War in the region, which will make the already weak and unstable island government more turbulent and make the entire region more corrupt. And China uses unconditional aid, which are mainly used for projects that affect public reputation rather promote economic development, thereby maximize its own diplomatic influence. And the author also used China's satellite-based station in Kiribati as an example to explain China's intention to seek military base in the Pacific. And besides, the author cites the development of island countries from geopolitical ambition in the 1930s to strategic era between 1940 and 1945, and then back to relative obscure status, and argues that the strategic significance of the Pacific Island countries ultimately depend on its participation in the interaction between the major powers. And with the normalization of China's aid to Pacific Island countries, scholars have quite more data on China's aid in the region and thus put forward a more realistic view, and their suspension of Chinese aid has been eased to a certain extent. And there are many articles here, and because of time, I will only briefly introduce one of them. So, let's see the article, China's Doubling Through the Pacific by Fergus Hansen. And this article introduced China's assistance to Pacific Island countries from 2005 to 2007. In addition to containing and eliminating Taiwan's influence in this region, the author believes that China almost doesn't have a comprehensive grand strategy to guide its aid in this region. The long-term competition between China and Taiwan leads to the tendency of China to pursue short-term goals, take short-term measures, and lack a coherent strategy. And the author also raised doubt about China's aid, believing that aid provided by China is unstable and doesn't consider the recurring cost. And this opacity of aid projected has caused suspicion by local government and other donor countries. And here are some other articles. If you're interested, you can search them on Google Scholar. So, with the passage of time and normalization of China's aid to island countries, scholars have changed their perspective of China's aid to island countries. Regarding the purpose of China's aid, Fergus Hansen believes the China's aid to island countries doesn't serve a long-term grand strategy, but a short-term aid mechanism that need to be improved urgently. Regarding the impact of Chinese aid, scholars such as Terence Wall Smith, Jie Yang, and Deng Huazhang all emphasize the positive aspect of Chinese aid to these countries, such as providing new aid options for island countries and providing local employment opportunities. And regarding the attitude of international scholars to China's aid, they can be roughly divided into two factions. One is skepticism, such as John Hudson, Benjamin Reilly, and Susan Wendbank. These scholars believe that China's aid to island countries will have a negative impact on the local area. And the other faction is the neutral faction, such as Terence Wall Smith, Deng Huazhang, and Jie Yang, and other scholars. They emphasize the advantages of China's aid to the island countries and raise some existing problem of China's aid and risk to the island countries. And then let's go on China domestic research. A representative book is Liaocheng's International Aid to the Pacific Island countries. The author introduced the overall situation and specific cases of China, United States, Australia, and New Zealand aid in Pacific Island countries. Although the book covers China's assistance to Pacific Island countries, it is still at general level and lacks specific case studies. And by investigating the current domestic research status, it is not difficult to find that China's domestic research on China aid in Pacific Island countries is relatively weak. And many studies briefly introduce the overall situation of China's aid in the region at a macro level and lack detailed case studies. Some articles have selected some cases to show the details of China's assistance in this area, but the cases used in the article are similar. Papua New Guinea and Fiji are the majority, but the countries with a relatively high proportion of aid to China are rarely involved, such as Tonga, Vanuatu, and Samoa. And Chinese domestic scholars are generally supportive of China's aid to Pacific Island countries and believe that Chinese aid has largely helped the development of Pacific Island countries. So, regarding the development trend of research on China's aid to Pacific Island countries, the focus of initial research was on the purpose of China's aid to Pacific Island countries. With the continuous development of China's aid to Pacific Island countries, the academic community has gradually gained a more comprehensive and detailed understanding of China's aid in this region, and conducted some case studies. Regarding China's aid model in Pacific Island countries, the academic circles are currently discussing the impact of China's aid in this region, such as the debt trap of China's aid. The research on China's assistance to island countries have shown a comprehensive and intensified trend. The current research focusing mainly on the purpose and impact of China's assistance to island countries and case studies have also been enriched. So there is less research on the issue in China, mainly because of the official aid data released by China is less and is limited, and the aid information is not transparent. And this issue is a political sensitive topic in China, and scholars do not want to do in-depth research on this issue. And their research must be consistent with official data.